I would call myself a cautious pessimist. I'm not predicting doom or collapse. I'm forecasting a more complex scenario. I would say in the next 7 to 10 years, you're going to see the peaking of the China miracle or China's economic rise. Then after that, there will be a period of erosion of economic momentum, rising tensions. Then what will happen, I really do not know. That's where my predictive power fails. Of course, I can conjure up different outcomes. For the next 7 to 10 year time frame, there are several very positive factors for China. Savings will remain very high, and economic growth relies primarily on savings rate, which provides investment. And the Chinese economic growth model is heavily dependent on high investment. China saves around 40 to 43% of its GDP and invests about as much. And with that kind of investment, you're going to have enormous expansion of capital and creating capacity for production and exports. So for the next 7-10 years, savings will constitute the most powerful engine of economic growth. The second positive factor is urban-rural labor migration, which creates two favorable conditions for growth. One is urbanization. Urbanization in China today is another domestic growth engine. Infrastructure, housing, services, just enormous momentum. The other is the flow of low-cost labor, younger, relatively healthy, reasonably well-educated Chinese rural residents flowing into urban areas, doing construction, service jobs, manufacturing jobs. That will continue for another 7 to 10, maybe 15 years. And then the third is China's deep integration into the global economy. China's another growth engine for China is export growth, 10, 15, 20% a year. China today is already the third largest exporter in the world and will soon be the world's largest. And that will continue for another 7 to 10 years, unless, as we will explain later on, China runs into problems abroad in terms of foreign backlash against Chinese exports. But these positive factors will disappear, will gradually disappear around 2015 to 2020. Then what will happen? What will happen is that at the same time, while these positive factors are driving the Chinese economy, there are several very negative trends in the Chinese economy that will progressively become more severe and probably will be very, very severe in 10, 15 years. Let me just list them. The first one is the imbalances in the economy, because the Chinese economy is dependent on investment. And China needs ever more investment in order to sustain the current level of economic growth. 40% of GDP year in, year out investment. Clearly, in 10, 15 years, you're talking about a huge base. That's not sustainable. And investment also creates overcapacity, and that will have consequences on the financial system. And third is the demographic trends in China are clearly unfavorable. 10, 15 years from now, China will become an aging society, low-cost labor will be much less abundant. China probably will have a labor shortage by 2020. Then that will impact China's savings rate, because older folks consume rather than save. So savings rate will come down as well. And then the current model of growth in China produces two deficits. One is the environmental deficit, enormous environmental degradation in China, even though the Chinese government is taking measures to deal with that. In the area of water shortage, air pollution, and soil contamination, soil erosion, the current trends are very, very unfavorable. And we don't know how the economy can absorb the ever-rising cost of environmental degradation. The other deficit is what I call social deficit, is that by over-investing in physical assets, the current government policies discourage investment in human capital, access to healthcare, access to education, and then that, because even though China has experienced a very rapid rise in wealth, investment in these two areas, in relative terms, has been either stagnating or declining. And that is an indirect contributor to rising inequality in China. Because if you go to China, you will find this paradox. Economy is growing high, but people's complaints are very, very intense. What are they complaining about? They're not complaining about lack of democracy, human rights. They're complaining about expensive housing, expensive healthcare, expensive education. So the social consensus for the current economic growth, if nothing is done, will erode. Today, I think it's already eroding because the Chinese economic reform is based on the so-called implicit social contract. It is that let some people get rich first, and then the entire society will get rich together later on. But the second part of the bargain has not yet been delivered. And what you have seen is an explosive growth in economic and social inequality. So the final question is, can the current government deal with this problem? I'm very doubtful because of the paradoxical effect of good times on reform. No government takes tough reform measures when times are good. So the next 7-year time frame, when we're talking about continued economic growth, because the raw momentum is strong and these positive factors are present, they actually act against reform in China. So the current government will simply let the good times roll, even though they are aware of the rising risks. So by the time all the unfavorable trends converge in China around 2015, 2020, then I think we're going to see a much more difficult time for the Chinese government. That's why I would say that by the time I would no longer, I'm almost absolutely sure myself that you're not going to see China growing at 10%. China will be very lucky to grow at 7%.